a death before prayers, a secret buried within the church walls. Welcome to Mystery Parlour. I am your host, Axon. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your comments mean the world to me. Now let's begin the mystery. It was generally agreed that the floral displays at St. Swithin's that Sunday were not, on the whole, up to Mrs. Bigby's usual standard. The chrysanthemums drooped in a manner that suggested resignation rather than praise, and a faint scent of polish, not petals, hung about the nave. Still, most parishioners, being polite, habitually observant of the parson's feelings, and secretly grateful for any deviation from Mrs. Bigby's horticultural tyranny, said nothing. The Reverend Tibbins, blinking nervously over his half-moon spectacles, had noticed the absence of Mrs. Bigby herself more than the state of her flowers. She was never late, never indisposed, and certainly never known to entrust her gladioli to anyone else's hands. Even her husband, a retired sub-postmaster whose silence was often misinterpreted as forbearance, knew better than to water her begonias without instruction. As the clock above the west door struck 10, the congregation had completed its ritual of mild coughs, hymnal fumbling, and sidewise glances. There was, as always, a faintly competitive edge to attendance at St. Swithin's. Miss Chubb from the library sat precisely halfway down the aisle, in order, she said, to be equidistant from both heaven and gossip, while Alderman Birtle made a point of arriving just late enough to suggest civic obligations. But when the choir began its uncertain entry, accompanied by an organist whose hands often seemed to be thinking in different keys, the gap where Mrs. Bigby's hat should have been, large, violet, and usually bobbing faintly with pious indignation, was unmissable. The Reverend faltered only slightly before embarking on the opening hymn. By the time the sermon reached its usual point of moral fatigue, that moment when the rector's voice acquired a faint drone like a kettle nearing its boil, something else had drawn the congregation's attention. There was a commotion near the vestry door, not loud exactly, but of that particular kind that makes even the most devout feel justified in turning round. 2 churchwardens, red-faced and whispering fiercely, had appeared. Behind them, a young constable, one of the newer recruits from the Flaxborough division, still uncertain about when to remove his helmet, hovered awkwardly. The Reverend Tibbins, sensing that divine inspiration had been overtaken by some terrestrial event, paused. He cleared his throat, then said with hesitant dignity, Perhaps we shall conclude the sermon here, in the spirit of brevity so seldom observed in holy matters." A murmur, respectful but expectant, rustled through the pews. Half an hour later, as the congregation milled, about outside St. Swithin's like a flock denied further crumbs, gossip had already begun to bud, bloom, and entwine itself with conjecture. Mrs. Bigby, it was said, had been found in the vestry, or in the churchyard, depending on one's source, quite beyond help. Some claimed she had fainted from exhaustion, others that she had fallen upon the shears she used to trim her dahlias. Miss Chubb, whose literary instincts inclined her toward melodrama, whispered that there had been a dreadful expression, not one of pain, but of recognition. Only one fact stood up to repetition. Inspector Purbright had been seen arriving shortly after 11, wearing his usual expression of mild curiosity, as if the whole business were a polite puzzle that someone had left half-finished on the vicarage table. Purbright was greeted by Sergeant Love, who, despite years in service, still managed to look faintly apologetic for the existence of crime. "She's in the vestry, sir. Dr. Hilliard says—" "Well, she's gone." "Indeed," said Purbright, in a tone that could have applied equally to a parishioner, a pheasant, or a misplaced umbrella. "And in church time, too. How inconsiderate." He entered the vestry with that deliberate, almost diffident tread that seemed to avoid disturbing even the dust motes. The body of Mrs. Bigby lay between the flower table and the small cupboard where surplices were kept. Her hands, pale and tidy, were folded in front of her. Her face retained a faintly affronted look, as though she had been told of her own death and found it badly arranged. On the floor, beside the tipped-over bucket of chrysanthemums, was a small bottle marked Silver Leaf Polish. Purbright's eyes rested on it for a moment. "Ah," he murmured. Not quite her usual perfume. Then, almost as an afterthought, he asked, "Was the door locked?" "From the inside, sir," Love replied. "Bolted. Had to be forced." Purbright nodded slowly. "How very private of her," he said. "Let's not rush to conclusions, Love. People can die tidily, but seldom conveniently." Outside, the church bell tolled the noon hour, and the congregation had already divided itself into factions. Those who pitied, those who speculated, and those who, despite themselves, felt the faintest thrill that something, at last, had happened in Flaxborough. Inspector Purbright stepped into the sunlight, buttoning his coat with a faint sigh. He looked for a moment at the empty flower stands along the path and the small crowd dispersing into gossip and respectability. "It's a very curious kind of devotion," he said quietly to Sergeant Love, "that ends with someone being early for the resurrection." The congregation, dismissed but not dispersed, drifted down the path like petals after a gust, carrying fragments of information that clung and recombined as they went. Purbright, with Love, quietly discouraging onlookers at the vestry door, questioned the organist, a narrow man named Prowse who wore anxiety like a borrowed cassock. Prowse had seen Mrs. Bigby before the service, bustling past with a basket of chrysanthemums and the expression of a woman who trusted Providence only if properly supervised. He had then taken his place at the organ and tried to persuade it into cooperation. He recalled, with a little shudder, a tang on the air as the processional hymn began, like new coins warmed in a pocket. "Not beeswax," he said, troubled. "Not incense either. Something sharper. I thought perhaps the silver had been attended to with zeal." "Polish," said Purbright. "And afterwards?" "The anthem was frightful," Prowse admitted, and looked grateful for the chance to deplore a lesser sin. "Miss Chubb whispered that Mrs. Bigby wasn't in her pew. I supposed she had gone to rebuke the alto line. Then the wardens knocked, and the bolt was firm." He paused. "She never bolted anything against attention in her life, Inspector." Purbright thanked him and let him return to the consolation of scales. Outside, the square vibrated softly with conjecture. Alderman Birtle declared that voluntary committees, left unchecked, would kill more people than influenza. Mrs. Crookshank from the bakery remembered selling Mrs. Bigby 2 macaroons and a sermon about waste. Miss Chubb, ringed by listeners, announced that one could always read death on a face if trained by fiction to notice punctuation. People nodded, pleased to have punctuation explained. A young constable tried to keep order and succeeded in rearranging it. Purbright and Love walked to the Bigby house, where the front garden made the kind of effort associated with committee minutes. Mr. Bigby opened at once, as if he had been expecting official condolences for years and had at last been proved correct. He was a compact, tidy man whose retirement had not been negotiated with his dignity. Purbright used the gentlest words. Mr. Bigby sat on the hall chair like a letter placed on the wrong shelf. "She had her health," he said at last. "She had her opinions. She never spared either. Was it her heart, then? She would dislike that, being common." "We don't yet know," Purbright said. "Did your wife take any medicine?" "Only for other people," Mr. Bigby replied with unexpected dryness. "She believed in tonics, moral or otherwise. She left early, wouldn't let me carry the basket. Said I bruised stems. She also took the church keys. Not that she had to. She distrusted shared doors. The keys had begun as a spare set from a fate. Over time, they had become, in Mrs. Bigby's view, an obligation to be shouldered alone. Nothing in the little house was out of place, though everything looked as if it had lately been warned. When they left, Mr. Bigby stood in the doorway with the patient astonishment of a man who has mislaid an argument and found a bereavement. Back at St. Swithin's, the vestry door showed a bruise of splinters where the bolt had yielded. On the tiles beneath the surplice cupboard lay a dark crescent left by a bottle that had rolled and kissed the floor. The silver cross rested on a cloth, half bright and half sulking as though the weather had changed midway through its thoughts. The cloth bore streaks that suggested a hurried hand and a doubtful conscience. Purbright touched nothing without a handkerchief. He smelled the polish and judged it confident. The window, frosted and high, stood unlatched. On its sill, where no pious hand would linger, a faint damp smear glistened in the draught. "Suicide, sir?" Love asked, apologizing to the word with his tone. "In a Sunday vestry," said Purbright. If it had been despair, she would have summoned an audience. His look drifted to the folded hands, composed as if by etiquette rather than peace. And if it had been accident, accident would not have tidied. A churchwarden, broad and conscientious, reported that several persons held keys. Both wardens, the organist, the verger, when he's sober, the Reverend, and Mrs. Bigby. "We shall need each person's movements between 9:30 and the anthem," Purbright said. "Collect them gently. People tell the truth more easily when they think it was their own idea." Love went to find the verger, who was located behind the public house and judged halfway to Candid. Purbright remained and let the room divulge what it could without conversation. He noticed a tea mug with a ring of polish on its saucer, a folded notice about the harvest raffle, and a small, unremarkable hairpin pressed under the polished tin's lid as if stored for later. He did not mention the hairpin. Instead, he asked whether Mrs. Bigby had ever left the vestry unlocked while arranging flowers. The warden, after respectful thought, said that she preferred locks as other people preferred cushions. "Did anyone quarrel with her about it?" Purbright asked. "With Mrs. Bigby," the warden said carefully. "Quarrel was a style, not an occasion." Love returned, faintly aromatized with brewery. "Verger says he unlocked early and left the wardens to it. Claims he opened the window to clear last week's beeswax. He swears he never touches polish. He also says Mrs. Bigby told him sinners shouldn't be trusted with silver." "Prudent of him to remember," Purbright said. "He will not mind if we remark later that the window was unlatched." He looked again at the cross, the cloth, the crescent smear. "There is a tidiness about this," he said. "Not cleanliness, tidiness, as if someone did not wish to dirty the wrong thing." "What was the right thing?" Love asked. "Perhaps reputation," Purbright answered. "Perhaps the day itself." They stepped into the nave, where the light made respectful ladders down the aisle. Parishioners still lingered, greeting one another with a solemnity made of concern and opportunity. Purbright moved among them with the gravity of someone listening for the furniture, of truth being shifted by a careful hand. The town would now busy itself with assigning motives to its neighbors. He must hear the allocations before they hardened. He must also learn who wiped a windowsill, who folded hands that did not fold themselves, and who had decided, this particular Sunday, to improve upon Providence. Purbright began with the warden called Greel, a conscientious man whose mustache seemed pressed beneath a hymn book. Greel repeated his tale with one improvement, which made his foresight slightly larger. He had checked the candlesticks, urged Mrs. Bigby to accept help with the silver, been refused, and gone to marshal the ushers. He had not returned until the organist's prelude limped to its end. "The vestry is best kept shut, Inspector," he concluded. "Temptations go by the corridor." "Temptations?" said Purbright as mildly as a man ordering tea. "Temptations to remark," said Greel, hoping it sounded like doctrine. Purbright thanked him and turned to the other warden, a lean widow named Mrs. Home, whose memory, she declared, was like a card index, Things were in their places if one asked correctly. She had seen Mrs. Bigby arrive just after 9:30 with the basket, and the keys held forward like a citation. Mrs. Hom had gone to look for the hymn numbers and, returning, found the vestry already bolted. She referred to the verger's pride in hinges. "We rely on him to air the place," she said. "When he remembers the weather is not personal." "And the Polish?" Purbright asked. "Provided by the ladies' committee," said Mrs. Hom, but she preferred her own. She did not trust a bottle whose lid had travelled. He asked about tea. "Always," the widow said. "Strong, hurried and reprimanding. There is no saucer safe from her." When they were done, Purbright let Love note the timings and moved into the aisle. The church had emptied to a respectful residue. Miss Chubb traced invisible lines on a pew back as if composing moral geometry. She saw Purbright and prepared her information with a novelist's briskness. She had gone to the vestry corridor before the anthem to raise a matter concerning the library book sale. The door had been bolted. She had listened, only to ensure no chorister was being corrected, and heard nothing at all. Silence of intention, she decided. Not prayer. "Did you smell anything?" asked Purbright. "Industry," she said. "Metal consenting to improvement, and a note I associate with the railway ticket tray. Old pennies grown thoughtful." Love took down names of those near the vestry during the service. 2 cousins from the fishmongers who swore they smelled only themselves. A visiting aunt intent on assessing the rector's theology, which she found kindly, and Alderman Birtle, who seized the chance to be useful by recommending the immediate suspension of the verger. "Drunken negligence has civic consequences," Birtle declared. "The man is an open window on delinquency." Purbright received this solemnly and suggested the alderman reserve his motion for the next meeting. Then he asked a small question: who, this particular morning, might have welcomed Mrs. Bigby's attention, being elsewhere? "Any hand within range of her guidance," Birtle said. "The ladies' committee is not a senate. It is a hive." In the vicarage parlour, the Reverend Tibbins offered tea with the air of a man granting absolutions. His wife, moving softly as if avoiding the cat they did not own, supplied milk and sympathy. Tibbins confessed to a recent vexation over the harvest raffle prize, a ham donated by the butcher and promptly claimed by the ladies' committee for distribution to a deserving case. Mrs. Bigby had urged the claims of Mrs. Kemblin, whose husband's gout had become communally expensive. Others had suggested the church organ fund on the grounds that music was spiritually poor. There were words, the vicar admitted, each intended for edification but delivered with accuracy. "Who had the keenest?" Purbright asked. "Mrs. Hartop," said Mrs. Tibbins, with the fairness of one who forgives efficiently. "She is keen in all things." She regretted that Mrs. Bigby confuses taste with goodness. "Mrs. Hartop has keys?" Love asked. "She has access," said Mrs. Tibbins. "She is everywhere." They found Mrs. Hartop in her front room training a geranium into a shape that, with perseverance, would resemble a principal. She wore a practical dress and an expression of fortitude chained to grace. She admired restraint in floral arrangements, found chrysanthemums assertive, and disapproved of over-polished silver as theatrical. About the ham she smiled. "Charity dislikes fussing," she said, "but fussing loves charity. I advise that appearances be kept tidy." "Did you quarrel with Mrs. Bigby?" Purbright asked politely. "Quarrel is a heavy word," said Mrs. Hartop. "I carry lighter ones until needed. I observed that fairness ought to look like fairness. She observed that fairness was an indulgence afforded to the unfair." "Where were you between 9:30 and the anthem?" "In the north aisle, discouraging Lilies from attempting soap." He asked to see her keys. She produced a ring that could manage a lighthouse. None matched the vestry's pattern. Love made a pencil rubbing, which pleased him. As they left, Mrs. Hartop watched through her lace and considered trifles, which are the pins that hold capitulations together. By late afternoon, the official account had already crisped at the edges. The verger was either a scoundrel or a saint. The window's latch grew more culpable with each telling. Children were warned not to polish anything without adult supervision. At the station, Purbright sat with a stack of statements he would later read in a different order to discover their true sequence. On his desk, a brown envelope held a small hairpin lifted from the polished tin's lid. He examined it as one studies a word that looks right until it is spelled aloud. Love returned with modest triumph. The ironmonger had sold 2 bottles of silver leaf in the past week. One to Mrs. Bigby on Thursday, as expected. The other, yesterday afternoon, to a person described as hatted, brisk, and unwilling to chat. Payment had been in coins exact to the penny. No one had asked for gloves, but a pair of thin cotton ones had gone missing from the counter last month. "Shopgirl blames the verger," Love said, apologetically faithful to tradition. "Everyone's sin is someone else's habit," said Purbright. "Did the ironmonger recognize the hat?" "He thought it belonged to a woman who does not answer greetings with words," said Love. "That narrows it very little." Purbright stood at the window and watched the town exchange versions under the prickly comfort of evening. A simple picture offered itself, a woman alone with a bottle and a task. Afterwards, silence, a bolt, and propriety accomplished by tidier hands. It would soothe Flaxborough, which likes an ending that reads like a rule. He waited, as ever, for the detail that refused the rule, and thought of the unlatched window, the tea saucer ringed with brightness, and hands folded as if arranged by someone who preferred neatness to truth. The next morning began with rain that could not quite decide whether it was respectable drizzle or committed weather. It slanted across the market square, chased the milk van, and turned the bunting above the town hall into damp, patriotic tales. In his office, Purbright regarded the window as if it had proposed marriage without consulting him. He had slept little, but comfortably. The puzzle was shaping itself with the modest logic of an English garden, full of familiar species behaving oddly. Love entered, dripping and hopeful, with a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "The doctor's report, sir. Nothing dramatic. Heart failure, they think. But he's not betting his reputation just yet." Purbright unwrapped the file and read slowly. There was no trace of poison, no sign of struggle. The cause, Dr. Hilliard had written, was cardiac collapse coinciding with mild respiratory distress, possibly induced by stress or inhalation of fumes. A neat phrase for death's small astonishments. "So," Purbright said, "our late Mrs. Bigby may have been undone by zeal in service of the almighty silver." "Or by someone else's zeal," Love said. "Doctor found polish residue under her nails, though not much. He said the smell lingered too strong for one bottle." "Interesting arithmetic," Purbright murmured. 1 corpse, 2 bottles. He closed the file. It would comfort the town to believe she simply cleaned too well. Let us see who profits from comfort. At 10:30, he and Love called at the ironmonger's again. Mr. Dodd, a man shaped by years of cautious balancing between nails and neighbors, confirmed the sale. The second bottle had been purchased on Saturday by a woman with a manner that counted change like confession. He could not swear to her identity, though he mentioned a black handbag that spoke of committees. Purbright thanked him and looked about the shop. The shelf where the polish stood was close to a rack of gardening gloves. He lifted a pair, new and spotless. "Do you stock many in this size?" he asked. "Few, Inspector. That's the small ladies' pair. We mostly sell to people with hands." "Then I shall note that 1 pair is missing from the count," said Purbright, replacing it gently. They next visited the library, where Miss Chubb presided over the public lending as if the books were well-bred but unpredictable children. She greeted the inspector with satisfaction, having spent the morning analyzing motives between borrowers of her detective section. "It is nearly always jealousy," she said, "and occasionally religion disguised as civic duty." Were the two ever distinguishable here? Purbright asked mildly. He inquired whether Mrs. Bigby had used the library recently. Miss Chubb produced a card showing the loan of a gardening book, Floral Virtues and Their Symbolic Uses. It had been returned Friday afternoon in her own hand. She complained of errors in the index, Miss Chubb said. That is how we parted. Errors, Purbright said. A dangerous species of temptation. They walked back toward the church. Rain had become a drizzle whose persistence mocked umbrellas. The vestry door was now padlocked pending further inquiry, but the keyhole still offered an odor faintly metallic. Purbright sniffed, frowned, and turned to Love. The scent remained stronger than it should after 2 days. That means spillage or renewal. Renewal, sir. Someone returned to tidy their earlier tidiness. He looked toward the vicarage. Reverend Tibbins seems unlikely to have done so between psalms. Inside, Mrs. Tibbins was found arranging condolence flowers into moral hierarchies. She claimed to have entered the vestry briefly yesterday afternoon to ensure no one disturbed what must now be considered a sacred space. She had, she said, noticed nothing out of order except the draught. The window again, Purbright said. Was it open? Closed, Inspector. Firmly. I took that as a sign. When she left the room, Love leaned closer. Could she have shut it herself? Certainly. But would she? Piety fears fingerprints. They thanked her and went out into the churchyard, where a few mourners were already rehearsing their grief for the coming funeral. Mrs. Hartop's umbrella appeared among them, a dark dome of civic gravity. She greeted Purbright as one greets an equal in burden. I'm assisting with arrangements, she explained. The ladies' committee wishes to demonstrate unity. How touching, Purbright said. Was Mrs. Bigby's successor chosen by acclamation or survival? Mrs. Hartop's lips thinned slightly. There was no vote. One does not scramble for duties left by the deceased. No, said Purbright, but one occasionally stoops. Her eyes flashed before manners reclaimed them. Inspector, if you imply contention among women devoted to charity— I imply nothing, he interrupted pleasantly. You imply very well without me. He nodded toward the vestry. You've been near that door since her death? Only to leave flowers, she said with saintly patience. Chrysanthemums, as she would have expected. Polished the vase yourself? He asked. She hesitated. It required attention. Dust had gathered. Ah, said Purbright, as if the matter were theological. I thought so. When she departed, he stooped to examine the slab by the vestry step. A faint streak of grey shone where rain had rinsed it imperfectly. He rubbed it with his gloved thumb and held it up. Residue, he said. Polish again. Recent and not applied by the hand of the deceased. Love bent closer. Then someone's been back to cover something, sir? Or to clean what they left behind, Purbright murmured. Mrs. Hartop's virtue may be polished as well. They walked back toward the station through streets grown bright after rain. The town, its curiosity refreshed, observed them with faces eager for conclusion. Purbright stopped at the tobacconist, bought matches he did not need, and remarked, Truth here will not be hidden in the dark, Love. It will be wiped too clean to see. Back in his office, he placed the small grey smear under a glass slide. Its grit, magnified, showed flecks of something not quite polish, a hint of wax mixed with ash. Ash, he said, and polish to disguise it. A hearth rag, perhaps, or a candle stub. He leaned back. If someone meant to burn something, Love, what would they burn that belonged to Mrs. Bigby? Letters, committee minutes, or an account, Purbright said, of fairness. Outside, the clock struck 5, and the drizzle returned, patient as the town's conscience. Purbright smiled faintly. Tomorrow, Love, we shall ask who keeps receipts for their virtue, and who needed to see hers destroyed. Morning returned with a brisk Protestant light, and with it the town's decision that zeal alone had finished Mrs. Bigby. Purbright, who mistrusted conclusions dressed for Sunday, resumed the harvest of small facts. He and Love called at the butcher's. Mr. Lockett, conscience whitened by apron, confirmed the raffle ham waiting in cold room. Public presentation had been, urged by Mrs. Hartop, private distribution by Mrs. Bigby. "Charity," said Lockett, "saves applause and spends suspicion." No money had changed hands. They went on to the ironmonger. Mr. Dodd, pleased to be necessary, repeated that a second bottle of silver leaf had gone on Saturday. The buyer wrapped a blue elastic round a small notebook after writing on his counter. Quick, tidy movements, exact change. No conversation. He could not name the hat. He remembered the silence beneath it. He produced the elastic left behind. Purbright slipped it into his pocket beside a hairpin from the polished tin's lid and nodded thanks. At the library, Miss Chubb had staged a display she called charitable reading, which consisted of indictments of human nature bound in tasteful covers. She recollected Mrs. Bigby using a blue-backed notebook on Friday. Names in a tall column, remarks in a narrow one. She considered morality a footnoted subject, Miss Chubb observed. I approved the punctuation. She added that footnotes invite addenda, and addenda invite enemies. Purbright's expression, never hurried, suggested a cautious agreement with both scholarship and peril. They visited the Kemblins. Mr. Kemblin's gout presided like a minor official who loved forms. Mrs. Bigby had asked questions, inspected curtains, and left with the expression of a woman preparing to be correct. Mrs. Kemblin mentioned two later callers who came to see how we were managing. One was Mrs. Hartop, identifiable by the sound of principal in the hall. The other wore a hat designed to refuse invitations and decline tea. Both approved the curtains without approving events. Back at the station, Purbright laid the hairpin, the blue elastic, and his timetable of doors on the blotter, 3 modest clues rehearsing a harmony. Love brought Hilliard's note. No poison, lungs irritated, wax mixed with polish. If anyone intended harm, Love said, they asked the smell to do the shouting. Quite, said Purbright, and afterward they folded hands and edited the scene. Papers too, perhaps. He studied the hairpin. Plain, serviceable, the kind that holds certainty together without display. A constable arrived with an envelope from the library. Inside lay a torn blue-edged page. Kemblin, pending, Caswell, deserving, Hartop, conflict of interest. Beneath in tidy economy, Polish cross, use own, committee bottle poor. Love exhaled. So she meant to shine both silver and reputations, and to remark on Mrs. Hartop while doing it. Or on Mrs. Hartop's closeness to the ham, said Purbright. Impartiality grows shy when supper is near. He pocketed the fragment. We need the remainder, the order and the omissions too. They crossed to Caswell's haberdashery, where twine taught muslin patience. Mrs. Caswell sold blue pads in 3s because a single pad makes enemies, but a packet looks like administration. She had supplied one to Mrs. Bigby on Wednesday. Late on Saturday, a woman of few syllables bought another and used her own pencil. The woman's hat, she said, had opinions she did not share. She could not name them. Purbright admired the brown paper, which, like alibis, folded without complaint. By late afternoon, the verger, fortified by remorse and lunch, confessed he had opened the vestry window late on Saturday to let last Sunday out, then been detained by discussion behind the public house. The latch might have been left shy of its duties. Purbright nodded as if hearing a hymn return to key. Neglect is often the usher of intention, he said. Opportunity now dwelt in the corridor, unintroduced to guilt, but willing to shake hands with most visitors. Toward evening, Mr. Bigby arrived. He was tidy in grief, like a letter pinned straight. Yes, his wife kept a blue notebook banded with elastic. Yes, it travelled in her handbag with a pencil. No, the handbag had not returned. He had told no one. She would not mislay it, he said. She mislaid other people. Dusk gathered the square as Purbright revisited the vestry window and saw a line on the sill where something had rested and been lifted. Next morning, Love, animated by faith in bins, searched the refuse behind Dodds and returned with a cotton glove, right hand only. Its tips were grey with polish and ash. The cuff had been taken in with dark thread to fit a narrower hand. Inside the hem clung a stiff hair, not the deceased's. They contemplated it while the office clock rehearsed honesty. "Invite the ladies' committee," Purbright said. "They shall sort papers, provide tea and too few cups tomorrow." The ladies' committee assembled in the police canteen with the expression of people obliged to admire an institution they had not founded. Rain had rinsed the town. The canteen, less susceptible to moral weather, smelled of steam and expectation. Purbright greeted them with gentle ceremony and set 2 shallow cartons of vestry papers on the table. "If you would be so good," he said, "sort these into minutes, notes, and miscellany. Anything that resembles a list of names should be kept separate, please." There were, as promised, too few cups. Mrs. Hartop surrendered hers without being asked, then watched, civilly hopeful, to see if the virtue had been noticed. Mrs. Harm discovered an extra saucer and made it do. Miss Chubb pledged herself to plain water with the ardor of a martyr in a tea shop. Love poured with an optimism that exceeded the crockery and, as an afterthought, produced a dented sugar bowl that reconciled almost everyone to a doctrine of cheerful insufficiency. Purbright set a thin bundle of blue-backed forms at the table's edge. "It will help," he said, "if any loose lists are secured. There are elastics in the drawer." He turned away to quarrel, mildly, with the kettle. When he turned back, Mrs. Hartop had produced from her handbag a small ring of blue, elastic, and bound her stack with the economy of someone who disliked the future's habit of scattering. Neat kid gloves shielded her hands from the canteen's democracy. Conversation migrated, as water finds a slope, from funeral arrangements to the ham that had matured into an emblem. Mrs. Hartop conceded the ladies' favoured public presentation on Harvest Sunday to encourage emulation, whereas Mrs. Bigby urged quiet distribution to discourage envy. "Envy breeds attendance," Miss Chubb remarked. "Secrecy breeds fiction. Our choice is between audiences." No one disputed the arithmetic. Purbright listened with a patience that sharpened rather than dulled. "Did any of you," he asked, "see Mrs. Bigby's notebook last week?" "A blue one?" Mrs. Hartop's tone suggested that blue notebooks incite bureaucracy. "Frequently. She wrote people down as if the page would later stand up and testify." Mrs. Harm nodded. "She made me initial the hymn numbers. She said accuracy is humility that can read." "And now the notebook is not at home," Purbright said, "nor in the vestry. It would be considerate if it declared itself." Papers shuffled like parish whispers. Mrs. Lanch, whose contribution to charity chiefly consisted of being present at it, found a half-sheet corrected in blue pencil. It listed names, including the Kemblins and, provocatively, the Hartops. Beside the latter, a neat bracket read, "Avoid appearances." Then a dash where the sentence had not yet found nerve. Mrs. Hartop studied the dash with the composure of one who prefers conclusions to arrive from elsewhere and be unarguably tidy. Love produced a plate of currant buns by which the canteen has long attempted reconciliation. There was, inconveniently or not, a single napkin. Miss Chubb tore it exactly in 3 and distributed the thirds with dry impartiality. "It is possible," she observed, "to convert shortage into method." "Shortage has often been a detective," Purbright said. He opened a drawer of cotton gloves used when handling exhibits and placed them on the table. "Do help yourselves if the paper soil is vexing." Most ignored them. After a fractional pause, Mrs. Hartop took a right-hand glove, slipped it on, and returned to bundling. The cuff stopped short of her wrist. With a small, practiced flick, she turned the hem in to make it neat and, remembering the gesture a second too late, occupied her other hand with a bun. Purbright allowed the room to resume its self-importance, while Love noted who took what, who knew where cups lived, and who disliked the table's democratic surface. When the cartons yielded nothing more treacherous than subscriptions in arrears, Purbright thanked the ladies and proposed that any recollection of keys, windows, or unorthodox zeal be sent to him by note. He bowed them out, gathered the cups like evidence, and sat with the quiet committees leave behind when they depart to accuse one another in comfort. Love laid a recovered blue elastic beside the one from Dodd's counter. "Same shade," he said. "Duty and malice share a shop." A constable found this in the vestry bin, Love added, producing a small tin. Inside lay the burned crumb of a blue-edged page and a sliver that might once have been sealing wax. Purbright set the fragment on a saucer and considered its refusal to name itself. "Notebooks that vanish sometimes leave their weather behind," he said. "This one forecast heat." He turned the right-hand exhibit glove over, measuring the neat fold in the hem. Tidiness needed disguises. Let us see if it will put itself straight today. Rain returned as if it had forgotten something, a thin, persistent drizzle that darkened stone and made the air smell faintly of soot and soap. Purbright and Love stood by the vestry window again, their breath forming ghostly rings against the glass. The church was locked now except for official visits, but the lock, like the truth, gave more easily when reasoned with. Purbright examined the sill, still faintly grey from the mixture of polish and ash. He leaned close, and this time noticed something new. A tiny fleck of sealing wax pressed flat against the wood. "A letter sealed and burned," he murmured, or perhaps only pride that caught fire too late. Love crouched beside him. "That bit of paper we found, sir, the one from the bin. It had wax too." "Indeed. It seems Mrs. Bigby's blue notebook was not only written, it was answered." Purbright straightened, brushing rain from his sleeve. "Let us call on our correspondents." They began with Mrs. Hartop. The door opened before the second knock, as if she had been rehearsing the gesture. Her composure was arranged like furniture before a guest. The drawing-room, neat to the point of rebuke, smelled of lavender and moral certainty. "Inspector," she said, voice crisp as linen. "I trust your gathering of yesterday has clarified the situation. It is always best when good order returns swiftly." "It is attempting to," Purbright said, examining a vase of chrysanthemums on the mantel. "You prefer these to lilies, I think." "Lilies are ostentatious," she replied. "They call attention to themselves as certain people did in life." "Mrs. Bigby?" Her eyes flickered, then resumed composure. "She was a woman of energy. Uncontrolled energy is a hazard, Inspector, even in the pursuit of righteousness." "Quite so," Purbright said. "Energy can polish both silver and conscience, depending on where it's employed. I believe she kept a notebook of her works and judgments." Mrs. Hartop gave the faintest smile. "So I've heard. A habit both industrious and unkind. I do not keep one myself. Reflection ought to be private." "Then you wouldn't have seen it recently?" She hesitated, a pause barely wider than a breath. "Only in her hands, last week when she visited. She accused me, if that is not too strong a word, of confusing fairness with ambition. I told her that ambition, properly aimed, improves fairness. She took notes." "Did she leave anything behind?" Purbright asked, looking toward the writing desk. Mrs. Hartop followed his gaze. "Certainly not. I maintain a strict desk." "Just so," Purbright said gently. "And yet yesterday, when helping in the canteen, you wore gloves. One glove, to be precise. Right hand only. May I ask if you still have it?" For a moment, the air in the room changed texture, as though the furniture had drawn breath. "You are observant, Inspector. I misplaced the other glove. Quite trivial. Trivialities often are, he said, until they become missing pieces. He turned to leave, bowing slightly. Thank you for your courtesy, Mrs. Hartop. Tidiness is, after all, its own confession. He and Love walked back along the street where rain had begun to dry into an honest drizzle. Love said nothing for several minutes, then, "She's the one, isn't she, sir?" "She's something," Purbright said. "Whether guilt or pride, both leave polish on the fingers." They stopped by the chemist, who confirmed that silver leaf contained ammonia strong enough to irritate the lungs, though not to kill unless confined in close air. A vestry, closed and bolted, would do nicely, Purbright murmured, particularly if the bottle had been opened earlier by someone else. At the station, the forensic report, Flaxborough's modest idea of forensics, confirmed the glove bore traces of polish mixed with candle soot. A fingerprint, faint but definite, crossed the hem's folded stitch. Purbright studied the report, then the small exhibit bag on his desk. "Love," he said, "what is the usual life expectancy of respectability in a small town?" "Depends how often it's dusted, sir." "Precisely. Too much polish can suffocate." That evening, under a fading light that made every shop window a mirror, Purbright called again at the vicarage. Mrs. Tibbins answered. Her husband hovered in the background, looking like a man afraid the parables might apply to him. "Reverend," said Purbright, "a small question. When you found the vestry locked on Sunday, did you notice whether the window was shut?" "Closed, certainly," Tibbins said. "I recall remarking it was odd, as the verger usually leaves it ajar to let the hymn books breathe." "Ah. So between Saturday afternoon, when he aired it, and Sunday morning, someone closed it. That small act, you see, may tell us who left last." The vicar looked pained. "Surely you don't mean to imply—" "I imply nothing yet. But someone wanted privacy for the polishing of both metal and memory. That privacy required a bolt, and only those accustomed to moral tidiness would tidy afterward." He left them uneasy in their hall. Outside, dusk settled like the end of a hymn, no one quite finished singing. Love waited by the car, stamping warmth into his boots. "Where to now, sir?" "To the graveyard," said Purbright softly. "Before it rains again." They crossed between gravestones slick with moisture, their inscriptions respectable and repetitive. At the far edge of the churchyard stood the bin where the glove had been found. Purbright knelt, examining the soil around it. A faint impression of a shoe, small, with a slightly turned heel, marked the mud. Nearby, half buried under a damp leaf, glinted a blue elastic, taut with age. He lifted it carefully, holding it to the light. "She came back," he said, "tidied again. But even perfection has fingerprints." He slipped the elastic into his pocket, straightened, and looked toward the vestry windows glimmering faintly against the sky. "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall test what remains of Mrs. Hartop's composure. Some stains," he added, "do not take kindly to light." By morning, Flaxborough had resumed its normal shape, but its surface gleamed with that special tension reserved for times when everyone knows something, but no one dares to claim credit for the knowledge. The town's gossip, trimmed and watered overnight, now bloomed vigorously along the high street. Mrs. Bigby's death had settled into that safe, thrilling category known locally as a tragedy with manners. Purbright walked to the station through a mist that seemed to rise out of people's opinions. He carried, as always, his small black notebook, less for what it recorded than for the reassurance it gave to those he questioned. People liked to imagine their words mattered enough to be written down. Love was already at his desk, nursing a cup of tea that had retired from service. "Morning, sir. I went by the ironmonger's again. Mr. Dodd says he remembered something. The woman who bought that second bottle on Saturday. He noticed her sleeve. Black wool, bit of a fringe. Not the sort you'd see at a bazaar," he said. More a Sunday best sort of thing. Purbright nodded. And did our ironmonger happen to recall whether she spoke? Not a word, sir. He said she smiled the way people do when they think it will make them less visible. Ah, Purbright murmured. The Hartop smile. It doesn't conceal the person, only the intention. He took a slow sip of tea, eyes half closed. We shall have her call at the station this afternoon. Nothing formal, just a polite conversation about Polish, notebooks, and the curious elasticity of moral conduct. Love grinned faintly. That's 3 topics most folks would confess to avoid? Precisely, Purbright said. The hours before Mrs. Hartop's arrival passed in a kind of polite suspense. A telegram arrived from the county laboratory confirming the trace of candle soot mixed with silver leaf polish on the glove's fingertips, and another residue, faint, waxy, scented with lavender oil. Purbright smiled. She embalmed her good deeds, he said softly. That will help. At 2:30, Mrs. Hartop appeared, punctual as penance. She entered the interview room with a composure that looked newly ironed. Purbright rose to greet her, his manner courteous, almost deferential. Love occupied the far chair, pretending interest in a notepad. "I'm grateful you agreed to come, Mrs. Hartop," said Purbright. "It spares me the indignity of sending an officer to disturb your afternoon." "I prefer to face unpleasantness directly," she said. "It makes it smaller." "How wise," Purbright replied, settling back. "You see, I've been troubled by details, not the obvious ones, those are merely decorative, but the small, inconvenient things that refuse to fade with time. For instance, the glove you wore yesterday. The right one." She blinked once, slowly. "I explained that, Inspector. I mislaid its pair." "Yes," Purbright said pleasantly, "and yet this glove, when found, had been shortened at the cuff with dark thread identical to what holds the hem of your sleeve." I checked. Quite the domestic touch. Her lips compressed, but she said nothing. "Then there's the matter of Mrs. Bigby's notebook. We now know she kept it faithfully until Saturday night, and that by Sunday morning the vestry smelled rather more of silver leaf than sanctity. I am not responsible for other women's accidents," she said. "True," Purbright agreed. "Though one might argue you are very responsible about nearly everything else. Too responsible, perhaps, when something untidy threatens the reputation of your committee." She shifted slightly. "If you mean the ham, Inspector." "Ah, yes," he said. "The ham. Symbol of generosity, battleground of virtue. Mrs. Bigby believed it should go quietly to the needy. You wished to present it publicly. She wrote as much. Unfortunately, she also wrote something else. About you and about appearances. That particular note was half burned, of course. The ashes matched the soot in the vestry, but one corner remained." He took from his pocket a small evidence bag, inside which lay the fragment of blue paper. On it, in faint pencil, was written, "Avoid appearances. H hides more than she polishes." For the first time, Mrs. Hartop's eyes flickered, not in guilt, but in calculation. "Anyone could have written that," she said finally. "Oh yes," Purbright agreed easily. "Anyone. Though not everyone would have sealed it with lavender wax, torn it and fed it to a candle while cleaning the cross. Only someone already in the vestry, with her own bottle of polish, her own gloves, and a key she wasn't supposed to use on Saturdays." Silence folded neatly between them. Love scribbled nothing on his pad, though the sound of the pencil filled the room. "Mrs. Bigby," Purbright continued softly, "was not poisoned, strangled, or struck. She was suffocated. The fumes, confined, heavy with ammonia, were enough. But she didn't open that bottle herself. The seal had been cracked earlier. You polished before she arrived, then bolted the door behind her, leaving the air to finish what propriety could not." Mrs. Hartop's breath caught, but she recovered it with the same discipline she applied to church linen. "If that were true, Inspector, You would have arrested me already." "I shall, if necessary," he said kindly. "But first I prefer to hear how you describe it. Duty, correction, or self-defense against embarrassment?" Her voice came slowly, evenly. "It was correction," she said. She would have ruined everything, years of careful respect, all undone by her endless writing, her pious meddling. She kept records, ugly ones. She intended to read them aloud at the next meeting. I warned her. She laughed. I only meant to silence her for a while. She stayed silent, Purbright said quietly. He rose, closing his notebook with the soft click of inevitability. "I'll have to ask you to remain here while Sergeant Love makes the arrangements. You understand, of course, that we shall tidy this matter up neatly." Her eyes followed him, dry and furious, as if tidiness were a word he had stolen. Outside, the drizzle had returned, finer and more persistent than before. Purbright stood beneath it, watching it silver the stones of the square. "A tidy town," he said to Love, as they stepped into the mist, "but rather too much polish for its own good." The following morning, Flaxborough woke to a version of calm that was not quite sincere. The church bell rang with dutiful punctuality, but its tone seemed thinner, as though the air had grown cautious. People nodded to each other in the street with unusual warmth, the warmth reserved for those who have shared a scandal and hope not to be mentioned in its footnotes. The newspaper, late as always, devoted 2 discreet paragraphs to a sudden death under investigation. But everyone knew what it meant. And everyone knew that Inspector Purbright had been seen walking Mrs. Hartop out of the police station with a politeness that made the escort seem like an invitation to tea. Purbright, that morning, sat at his desk, his hands folded over an envelope addressed to the chief constable. The rain had polished the windows, and the whole world outside looked temporarily unburdened of dust. Sergeant Love entered, carefully closing the door. "The matron says Mrs. Hartop didn't sleep," he reported. "She's quiet, not the kind that repents. More the sort that edits." Purbright gave a small nod. "An industrious habit. She will have spent the night rearranging motives into something genteel. But guilt rarely stays tidy once daylight arrives." He tapped the envelope lightly. "You'll take this down to the superintendent. There'll be a hearing within the week." Love hesitated, then said, "She keeps saying she didn't mean to kill her. That she only meant to frighten her into staying quiet. You think there's truth in that?" "There's truth," Purbright said, "but only the kind that still lies about intent. A woman like Mrs. Hartop never believed she could be guilty of murder, only of excessive correction. Her conscience will dress the crime in its Sunday best." Love frowned thoughtfully. "And that notebook, sir? The one Mrs. Bigby kept? I keep thinking about it. You never found it whole?" "No," said Purbright, looking toward the cabinet where evidence sat in patient silence. "Only fragments. But sometimes fragments tell more than a whole page. The last word she ever wrote was avoid. A pity she couldn't." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Reverend Tibbins, hat in hand, his face pale with the delicate misery of a man forced into worldly matters. "Inspector," he said, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. There's something I felt you should see. It concerns the vestry." Purbright gestured him in. "Do sit down, Reverend. I find the vestry seldom finishes its stories at the first telling." Tibbins produced a folded envelope, speckled faintly with candle grease. "This was pushed under the vicarage door this morning. I thought at first it was a subscription notice, but, well, perhaps you'd best read it." Inside was a single sheet of church notepaper. The handwriting was careful, but wavering, as though the writer had decided courage was more important than grace. It read, "There was more than one key, and not all that was burned was paper. It was unsigned." Purbright held the note up to the light. "Interesting phrasing," he said quietly. "The town's conscience is never anonymous without purpose. Love, fetch me the vestry keys from the evidence drawer." Within the hour, they stood again beneath the church's grey arch. The drizzle had paused long enough to allow the sound of their shoes on the stone to echo through the nave. The air carried its usual residue of polish and old hymnals, but there was something else now. A faint sweetness, like flowers beginning to decay. Purbright looked around the vestry slowly, his eye moving from the flower table to the cupboard where Mrs. Bigby's hands had been found so neatly folded. There was more than one key, he repeated softly, meaning perhaps that Mrs. Hartop wasn't the only visitor that morning. Love crouched near the floorboards, tracing the outline of a darkened patch beneath the cupboard. "This was scrubbed in a hurry," he said. "Looks like wax again, same lavender scent." Purbright crouched beside him. "And under the boards, do you see that glint?" Love pried the edge of one plank gently with his penknife. Something thin and metallic winked in the crack, a small key no larger than a glove button. Purbright examined it with quiet satisfaction. A duplicate, crudely filed. Not official issue. Whoever made it valued access more than permission. They took it back to the station. By afternoon, a visit to the locksmith confirmed it had been cut at Dodd's. Not recently, but within the past fortnight. "A lady brought it," said Dodd, squinting at his records. "Black sleeve, wool fringe. Paid in exact change. Said it was for her garden shed." Purbright thanked him and walked back slowly, thinking. "A garden shed," he said aloud, once they reached the square. "How apt. Seeds planted, growth carefully tended, and at the end, something poisonous blooms." When evening came, Purbright visited Mrs. Hartop again. She sat by the cell window, the bars shadowing her face like narrow hymns. She did not rise when he entered. "I've had an odd message," Purbright said mildly. "Someone thought it worth reminding me that you were not alone in your zeal, that there was another key." She looked up sharply. "Nonsense. Only I could have entered that place. Everyone knows that." "Ah," said Purbright, "but sometimes knowledge is only another lock, and keys, I find, are fond of company." Her composure wavered. "You think someone helped?" "I think," Purbright said, "that someone watched you help yourself. Someone who saw you clean what you thought must be dirt, and who let you go on believing it was righteous. Perhaps they even gave you the key." Mrs. Hartop's hands tightened on her knees. "Who?" "That," said Purbright softly. "I've not yet decided, but whoever it was, they preferred that the town believe in your perfection. You've served their purpose beautifully." He left her then, standing beneath the soft hum of the corridor light. Outside, dusk had drawn its grey curtain over the town again. The church bells sounded the half-hour, a calm, indifferent tone that fell into the silence like something precise and final. Purbright walked slowly down the corridor, the faint scent of lavender still clinging to his coat, thinking how Flaxborough never lacked for virtue, only for humility. The following day broke sharp and pale, the kind of morning that left puddles stiff-edged with frost and made the town's roof steam faintly, like thoughts unwilling to settle. Purbright walked the short distance from the station to St. Swithin's, his coat buttoned high, his expression more curious than grim. Behind him, Love carried a brown folder and the air of a man uncertain whether the case was closing or widening again. They reached the church just as the verger was unlocking the porch. He looked less sheepish now, either from the sobering effects of guilt or the comfortable belief that the worst was over. "Morning, Inspector," he said. "Got the place aired out as you asked." Purbright stepped inside, the cold stone breathing around him. "Aired out," he repeated. "Good. Death and polish both linger longer than they should." He stopped before the vestry door, which was open for once, the bolt repaired and shining like a lesson learned. The scent that met him was no longer lavender, but something flatter, paper and dust, the aroma of concealment rather than devotion. "You've not been tidying further, have you?" he asked over his shoulder. "No, sir. Not since you took them keys." I thought best to leave things as they are." "Excellent," said Purbright. "For once, disorder may be our ally." Love knelt again by the floorboards where they had found the small key. He ran his torch along the seams. "Still looks sound, sir. Nothing else wedged beneath." "Nor should there be," Purbright murmured. Whoever used the duplicate key had little time for sentiment. They took what they wanted and left the rest to burn. He turned to the verger. "You told me before that Mrs. Bigby and Mrs. Hartop weren't the only holders of keys. The Reverend, the organist, and yourself also had them?" "That's right, sir, though I swear on the font I didn't lend mine to nobody." Purbright smiled faintly. "Of course not. But I wonder if anyone borrowed it all the same, say, to make a quick copy while you were preoccupied at the public house." The verger blinked, reddening. "You mean that Saturday? I only stepped out a few minutes." "Just long enough," Purbright said, his voice gentle, "for someone to slip into the vestry, take an impression, and be gone. You wouldn't have noticed." Love, who had been examining the window frame, spoke up. "There's wax in the latch again, sir. Thin film, fresh. Not polish this time, just candle." "Curious," said Purbright, stepping closer. "Candle wax used to seal something, perhaps, and later removed. Someone still tidying, someone who hadn't learned the lesson." He pocketed the small flake Love had lifted with his knife, then turned to the verger again. "Who has been here these past few days, aside from yourself?" "Just the Reverend, sir, and Mrs. Tibbins once or twice, and young Prowse, the organist, practicing for the funeral hymn." "Ah, yes," said Purbright. "Prowse, a man whose music has always sounded like an apology." The verger snorted before remembering his company. "He's harmless, sir, lives for the organ, talks to it even." "Harmlessness," said Purbright, "is often camouflage." They left the church, walking through the thin sunlight toward the organist's lodgings, a small cottage near the schoolyard. Prowse answered their knock immediately, as though expecting absolution or reprimand. He was pale, dusted faintly with chalk from music paper. "Inspector," he stammered, I heard you'd found who did it." "We found who believes she did," said Purbright, "but belief, like harmony, can deceive if the wrong note is held too long." He gestured toward a chair. "You were here on Saturday evening, I think?" Prowse swallowed. "Mostly, yes. Except, well, I went to the church just before dusk. I needed to check the stop mechanism. Mrs. Hartop was there, and Mrs. Bigby too. I didn't mean to intrude." Love's pencil paused mid-note. "You saw them both together?" "For a moment only," he said quickly. "Mrs. Bigby was cleaning the silver, and Mrs. Hartop was holding the polish. They were speaking, but quietly. I thought it best to leave. Later I went back for my hymn book, and the door was shut." "Was it locked?" asked Purbright. "I didn't try it, sir. Only heard voices still. I came away. Next morning, well, you know the rest." Purbright regarded him with mild patience. "And you said nothing because?" "Because," Prowse said miserably, "they were ladies' committee business. I thought it above me. I'm only the organist." "An enviable position," said Purbright softly. "You hear everything and are required to say nothing." They left him in a confusion of relief and shame. Outside, Love shook his head. "So there it is. She wasn't alone with Mrs. Bigby after all." "No," said Purbright, "but she became alone soon enough. One woman left through the door, and another through silence. The question is who turned the key." They returned to the station where a telegram waited, forwarded from the chief constable. The fingerprint on the hem of the glove, it said, was partial, but did not belong to Mrs. Hartop. Purbright read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in his breast pocket. She killed her, yes, but she did not fold her hands. Someone else finished the arrangement. Love stared. "Then who, sir?" Purbright looked toward the window, where the fading light had turned the square to brass. "Someone who knew the pattern of her gloves," he said. Someone near enough to tidy after sin without leaving a trace of scandal. The same someone, I think, who sealed that anonymous note. Wax and lavender again, and a conscience still trying to polish what it cannot forgive. Love's eyes widened. Mrs. Tibbins. Perhaps, Purbright said quietly. The vicar's wife is not often careless, but she is devoted to the appearance of order, and she too had a key. He closed the folder, his manner calm, unhurried. Tomorrow we'll pay a call at the vicarage. Respectfully, of course. After all, it's only fair to give Grace the chance to confess before we polish it away. The following morning brought a peculiar brightness, the kind that never quite feels warm but makes edges clearer, as though the world itself were preparing to be confronted. The air smelled faintly of smoke and soap, and from the church a bell tolled with brisk punctuality, denying it had ever presided over tragedy. Purbright walked the narrow lane toward the vicarage, his step as steady as the logic gathering behind his eyes. He carried no files, only his notebook and a small paper envelope that made a dry whisper in his pocket whenever he moved. Love followed, frowning at the sky. "Feels like the town's trying to start over, sir," he said. "It usually does," Purbright replied. "Flaxborough has short memory but long habit. The difference between the two is where truth hides." At the vicarage door, Mrs. Tibbins answered before he could knock twice. She looked smaller today, or perhaps simply reduced by sleeplessness. Her hair was neat, her apron folded as though she feared wrinkles might suggest moral weakness. "Inspector," she said, managing a smile that trembled between courtesy and alarm. "You've come about the arrangements for the funeral, I suppose." "In a sense," Purbright said gently. "May we step inside? It's a matter better spoken with the fire for company." She led them into the parlour. The air was heavy with lavender, and on the mantel stood a small candle, half-burned and faintly sweet. Purbright drew it toward him with care. "A comforting scent," he said. One could almost believe confession itself were perfumed. Mrs. Tibbins's hands fluttered at her apron. "I light them for the Reverend's nerves. He suffers from sleeplessness." "Yes," said Purbright softly. "And I imagine it's difficult to sleep when one's conscience insists on sharing the pillow." She froze, her breath catching like a page turning too quickly. "I don't understand you, Inspector." "Then allow me to make myself clearer," Purbright said, settling into the chair opposite her. "Mrs. Hartop, as you know, has admitted to her role in Mrs. Bigby's death. But her story was incomplete. Someone entered that vestry after she left. Someone tidied the scene, folded the hands, latched the window, and lit a candle to burn away what remained of a note. The wax was lavender, the same as yours." Her eyes widened, but he pressed on, his voice gentle as the drizzle outside. "We found more traces in the latch, just enough to show the hand that touched it wore no glove. And this." He drew the envelope from his pocket, opening it to reveal a blue-edged corner of paper, smoke-stained but legible. "H hides more than she polishes," it read. "This scrap was found in your stove ash, Mrs. Tibbins. You tried to finish the burning that Mrs. Hartop began." She stared at it as though it might speak first. Then, with a long, fragile exhale, she sat down. "I only meant to keep the town from shame," she said at last. "Our church, our work, it would have been ruined. Mrs. Bigby was unkind, Inspector. She had no mercy for anyone who fell short of her perfection. Even Henry. She had written things about him." "Your husband?" Purbright asked quietly. "Yes. The Reverend has struggled. His congregation expects a kind of saintliness that is exhausting to maintain." She was going to read her notes aloud at the meeting. Said she could not serve with hypocrisy. "I found that page, when I went to tidy the vestry after the commotion. I knew what it would do if anyone saw it." Purbright let the silence settle before speaking. "You didn't intend to protect Mrs. Hartop. You were protecting your husband." She nodded once, a small motion of defeat. He knew nothing. I burned the rest. I thought if I made it look peaceful, it would seem like the hand of God, not of man. I folded her hands myself. Love looked down. His usual sympathy curdled into awe. All this, he said softly, for reputation. Mrs. Tibbins turned her face toward the fire. For peace, she whispered. Purbright regarded her for a moment, his expression unreadable but not unkind. You see, Mrs. Tibbins, Flaxborough forgives almost anything, except a public scandal. You did what many would have wished, but only you had the nerve. The law, however, prefers its peace untidy. She bowed her head. Will they take me away? He stood, closing his notebook. For a time, yes, but not forever. The truth seldom holds anyone long in custody here. In the end, it's habit that sentences us. She nodded faintly, tears unshed. You're right, Inspector. I suppose I only ever wanted things clean. When they left the vicarage, the drizzle had stopped, leaving the cobblestones slick as old pews. Love walked beside him, thoughtful. So Mrs. Hartop killed her, and Mrs. Tibbins made it holy. Precisely, said Purbright. Between them they turned a death into a parable. The church will be most grateful. And you, sir? Purbright smiled faintly. Gratitude is not my department, love. Only understanding. They passed St. Swithin's once more. The air smelled faintly of soap and chrysanthemums again. An attempt at renewal, perhaps. Inside, the silver cross gleamed faintly in the filtered light, bright but not boastful. Purbright paused at the gate, glancing back toward the churchyard. You see, love, he said, in places like Flaxborough, wickedness rarely shouts. It tidies up, closes the window, and leaves a note no one reads. He turned up his collar against the wind, his voice low but firm. And all we ever do is reopen the window. Then, without haste, he walked away down the narrow street, the faint echo of the bell following him until it faded into the ordinary rhythm of the town once more.